Welcome to the Dylan Experience. Today is episode 67, and I've got another special guest for you today. But before we get to that, make sure you like, subscribe, follow the channel, do whatever you need to do to stay in touch with us. But my next guest is a mom, a parenting author, a nationally syndicated humor columnist, and a podcast host, creating content that helps empower parents, especially moms, by giving them permission to embrace their perfectly imperfectness. She's also a survivor of suicide loss, losing her father at age 10. Lisa writes the syndicated opinion column, It Is What It Is, and is the author of How to Raise Perfectly Imperfect Kids and Be Okay with It, Untying Parent Anxiety, and Life, It Is What It Is, available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and everywhere good books are sold. My guest is also the co-host of the podcast Life Unfiltered on iTunes and iHeartRadio, and a regular contributor on Healthline Parenthood, Grown and Flown, Today Parents, Thrive Global, Care.com, Little Things, and more content now. My guest today is Lisa Sugarman. Lisa, how are you?
I'm great. I'm great, Dylan. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And obviously in that bio, we have a lot to talk about. I feel like we were talking before the episode, and I had to cut it off because I felt like we were going to give away all the answers before we take the test. So I let me just let you introduce yourself. Of how did you how did you get here? How did you get to this point of being on podcasts, being an author, doing all the things that obviously you do? How did you become this incredibly powerful woman that you are?
Oh, I love that. I'll take that distinction every day. I appreciate it. You know what? It was almost like I fell backwards into all of it. It's just like it was not the plan. There was nothing that there was no like vision board, and there was no like expectation of I'm going to write a bunch of books and I'm going to write a column and go on the radio and I'll have a podcast. And it just one thing led to another thing, led to another thing, and I guess it's all because I really almost never say no to good opportunities because they lead you to other great opportunities.
Yep.
So, I mean, I've always been a writer, like going back to like college and grad school, I was always a writer, college and high school newspapers and all that. And like the second I graduated from high school, from college, I went right straight to a job at a newspaper and magazines and did that kind of writing, and actually ended up writing for a healthcare publishing company. So I was doing like all kinds of writing. Some was technical, some was not. And then my husband and I had our two daughters, 3 years apart. One is our youngest is 22, our oldest now is 25. And it was I was a stay-at-home mom. I was always a working professional forever. And then Dave and I just decided we wanted to just, one of us, whoever, it would be, would stay home with the kids because it was important to both of us. And it ended up being me, which I was so grateful for. And it was during that time that I just, it was almost like a reinvention. It was like a deconstruction and a reconstruction of kind of who I was. And now all of a sudden I was a mom, and that was like my wheelhouse. It was where I spent my time. It was my energy was going there, and my passion was now my kids. And so I hadn't really written in a really long time. And just for the hell of it, I just contributed to our local paper, and everything kind of started there. So we live in Massachusetts. We live north of Boston, and a tiny little harbor town that we were living in at the time. And it was like my old newspaper that I wrote for when I was in college, and they are always asking for contributions. And so I just did, and it just kind of lit up. It took off, and um, they were like, "Why don't you just do this regularly?" Which I did, and then we branded it, which I did, and it became It Is What It Is, and then it just kind of shot. It just shot everywhere, and it ended up all over the place on all these great parenting platforms, and um, in all of the newspapers that this chain owned, and they were like the largest newspaper chain, um, community newspaper chain in the country. So it was like there, and then a book came from all of those columns, and then an opportunity to write for this incredible publisher, Familius Publishing out in California, popped up. And then when we were promoting the book, my co-author and I were promoting the book, someone asked us to come on the radio and just talk about the book. And that led to a morning show every Sunday for like over 2 years on the
Wow.
radio called Life Unfiltered. So it's like I just kept hopping from organic opportunity to organic opportunity. And here I am.
And you can't underestimate the power of an opportunity. That's why, like,
Mm,
I've done the same thing in a lot of my, I guess, my multiple careers, because this isn't the only thing I do. Um, I I've been in the military for almost 15 years, and when you just say yes to things, right, it just takes you in a wave of directions you never expect.
mm,
Certainly what I do now is something I never expected. I can imagine. um I have always been a very introverted person. I don't really care to be out in public or talk to people,
yeah.
for that matter. But after my whole, kind of saga with mental health back in like 2015, that was when I kind of forced myself to be different, right? To go talk to people, to go
Mhm,
have conversations I've never had before, to go just be honest.
yeah.
And I took that facade away from myself, and I started just acting like myself, no matter who was around me, right? And like when that when that lifted, right, when you take that weight off, that's when I think the opportunities really become remarkably valuable.
Yeah.
Where when you say yes and it's 100% like, this is what I'm just going to do it, right? And you're honest about it, and you're like, I don't know if I'm going to like this, because I can be honest, like I have not always enjoyed everything that I do with the podcast, with the social media stuff.
Mm,
I just haven't. Like I don't like doing content creation. I would love if someone else filmed me and did all the editing. I hate editing. I can't stand it. Right?
yeah.
This is why, like, my podcast is so simple. All I do is add a watermark in front and behind, and then that's it. Like, that's
Mhm,
my podcast, right? If I make mistakes, I try not to edit those out, right?
yeah.
If I don't have to, because I don't want to go find them, because I hate editing, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah. No, I as someone who spends probably 75% of my time
oh my
doing
god,
that promoting and that marketing and we did our show, it was a radio show on a local Boston radio for a radio station. So they did the editing, thankfully.
yeah,
But I totally hear you. And
yeah,
it's so cumbersome. It's such a pain.
yeah. But when when you start to get, like, even that editing, that has taught me so much about, like, at some point I'll have someone else do it, but I'll know what I'm talking about when I have
Yeah.
that conversation. Is like, I I know how much this sucks, right? And I'm so focused on mental health that I'll probably care more about about their mental health than actually like my product. I'll probably be like, I know this sucks, right? Let me know how I can help you, but also, uh, you know, I know how valuable this is, right? So
Mm,
I'm gonna actually pay someone their value, rather than, like, you know, being an ignorant business owner and being like, you know what, I can't afford that, right? Like, I'll pay the value, right? I just,
yeah.
I need to get to that point. But those opportunities just continue to grow, especially if you say yes.
Yeah.
But I think, here's the interesting part, and I think maybe this kind of leads us into why we have so much in common. And I think our perspectives are very much going to align in a lot of things because of this. Um, Saying yes is often, I think, a response that comes from our own history and our own past.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, how do you kind of approach that in terms of, what happened with your father, and obviously comparatively to mine. um it was very much a trauma response for me. I took every opportunity I could, because I was trying to basically make light of his perspective, right?
Mm,
And bring his perspective into into my life, and say, I have to do this because that would make him proud.
yeah.
And I'm really curious about how did you approach life after your father ended his life?
So for me, it's a really layered question
Yeah.
because and this is the nuance to my own story, which is just makes it a little bit different than your average story, I guess, of loss, because I've actually lost my dad twice, which is it sounds like a
Oh,
really weird thing to say, and it's like, how is that even possible? So I'm 50, I just turned 54. And when I was 10 years old, right after my 10th birthday, my dad passed away from what I was told was a very sudden and massive heart attack. And he was super fit guy, mountain climber, tennis player, just car driver. I mean, race car driver, very, very active, but he was also a very heavy smoker at the time, and there was heart disease in the family. So there was zero reason for me to ever question
Yeah.
why he had died in the way that I was told that he had died. So, um, in that way, and then flash forward 35 years, that's the narrative that I carried with me. That was the belief that I had for 35 years.
Wow.
So everything was about doing things that my dad would appreciate or would be proud of, like you, or would respect, or um, would just appreciate. So yeah, I was totally driven by that. In everything that I did, I saw him in everything. I tried to
Yeah.
do the things or go to the places where I felt his presence the most. Like I grew up peak bagging or mountain climbing here in the White Mountains of New Hampshire in the East Coast. And like he was a huge mountaineer. And so I was, had a backpack on from the time I was like 5 years old. And we did that until he passed away. And so I mean, I would seek out those opportunities and those experiences with him in mind. And it was a way to do them together if I went ahead and did them myself. So I definitely um, had him kind of at my six
Yeah.
forever, my whole life. And then something happened, and I just had a very, very random conversation with a family member who really didn't even know that she was kind of unlocking Pandora's box. But she asked me about the mental health of my children in the context of my dad. And I was like, well, what do you mean? Like we hadn't seen each other for a long time. So we are just
Yeah.
catching up. Completely random question. And all of a sudden I started wondering, like, what do you mean by that?
Right.
And she's like, his issues with depression. And I'm like, oh, I actually don't know that. And so my mom and I have an incredibly close relationship. Like when my dad was alive, he was my person. My mother has obviously become my person. Um, what I didn't know that I ultimately ended up finding out when I questioned my mom about my dad's mental state was that he had actually taken his life. And it was just, I asked the question. I don't know where the question came from. I don't know if you've ever had a situation like that where you weren't even consciously thinking of something.
Yeah.
When my cousin told me that my dad had had some issues with depression, it didn't lead me all of a sudden to the conclusion that he had taken his life. Like that was nowhere in my headspace at all. And then a conversation with my mom, it just I think I'm a big believer in someone putting kind of a hand down from above, and it's your time and you were supposed to find out. And so it came out that he had actually taken his life, and so that just, like, everything changed in that moment. Everything changed and nothing changed, which
Right.
was kind of interesting. But I went through that loss all over again, and so it really took me very far from him. It you know that long hallway in the movies that just keeps getting longer and longer. I was at one end and he was at the other, and it just kept going in opposite directions for a very long time. So I couldn't think about him. I couldn't do anything in honor of him or memory of him, or it really shattered me.
Yeah.
And I've now come to a point where in the last several years, because I've now known this for a while, so it's been like 7 or 8 years since I found that out, I re-grieved his whole
Yeah.
death from a completely different angle. And um, I had always been a big believer that suicide was a very selfish act, which a lot of people are like that and believe that,
Yep.
until I just started digging into mental health and suicide awareness and prevention and understanding like what he was really going through. And then of course your mind just explodes and you're like, no, 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 no. This is an illness. This is
Yeah.
a chemical imbalance. This is beyond your dad's or my dad's control.
Yeah.
And that's what's kind of that's changed the whole trajectory of my life and of my work and of the writing that I'm doing, the content that I'm creating, the conversations that I'm having.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm now like on the other side of that forgiveness piece and acceptance piece. And now it's like I feel closer to my dad than I ever have before. And now I'm back to that point where everything that I'm doing is driven by my this intrinsic need that I have to really just be um to live for both of us, I guess is the kind of cliche way of saying that. I now do everything with him in mind.
Yeah. I'm I'm so curious. I didn't expect that because I was told at 6 years old my dad did end his life.
Mm.
And so like having this in contrast, I'm so curious of like, do you feel, how do you feel about like I was given the truth, you were given a lie about what happened. How do you feel that affected your growth as a human being? Like how do you think that affected your grieving at that age? And obviously now you re-grieved. But I think, it's as an adult, you were in a maybe a more stable place or a more understandable place to hear that news. But I can imagine there's a sense of betrayal in there.
You know what? I can really understand why you would say that. I have never, you mean like by my mom or by the circumstances?
Sure.
Yeah.
In whatever capacity.
Yeah. I have never, for a single second of time since learning the truth about my dad's death, I have never once felt betrayed. I never felt any anger toward my mother. I felt this incredible wash of gratitude because while I don't have the mental illness, I don't believe that I have the same type of mental illness that my father had. I know that, and I've never really talked about this part publicly,
Mhm.
but until right now, that I mean, I definitely, there's a darkness in there. Like I definitely, there are dark thoughts. There are, I've never attempted to take my life. I've never been suicidal. I've definitely been depressed. Have definitely, and the only way that I can classify it is to say that there is a darkness that's there that I really consciously have to work at, not sidestepping because that's not a solution, but at understanding and
Yeah.
managing. And it just in that moment when I found out how he died, I had always carried with me just this incredibly um like almost whatever comes beyond an empath. Like I know that about myself. I know that I'm an empath. I feel everything that everyone around me feels. I feel the highs and the lows, and all of it. I feel those vibrations. I always have. But it's almost like whatever could be beyond an empath is where I kind of always felt that I am. And it's rough sometimes. It's really rough to just not be able to shut your mind off and not be able to feel things quite as intensely. Like like I might be feeling something that you're going through
Mhm.
as deeply in some ways as you are. That's how it is. And that answered a lot of questions for me. It clarified a lot of things for me. It showed me what I was and what I wasn't,
Mhm.
what was going on inside and what wasn't going on inside. And so no, I have never, I couldn't have handled it, Dylan. Like I don't think, I was a pretty strong kid. I don't think that I ever could have handled at that time knowing that my dad had willingly taken his life for whatever the reason. Like obviously clearly you know there was a lot going on under the surface that no one knew about, including my mom. No one did.
Yeah.
But I don't think I could have handled it. So that was 1000% the right call. And I'm so grateful to my mom for just having those instincts that um, that would have been a catastrophe
Yeah.
to have layered that on top of, you know, dad died. And oh, by the way, he took his own life. So, and also she wasn't planning on ever saying anything about it because it's like, kind of the runaway train. All of a sudden now I was like going into middle school and then I was going into high school and then college. And then like she didn't consciously want to lay that on me and have such a negative impact on me or powerful impact. And so, and then I was getting married and then I was having kids. And then it's like, well, why is it even necessary at this point?
Yeah.
And just as it happened, it was supposed to happen when it happened. So, you know, uh,
It's very interesting.
mm,
I've always been one that I'm really happy with my mom's honesty in my
Mm,
situation.
mhm,
Um, did I almost not make it through it? Yeah, that almost happened, right? And but that I would never put on my mom, nor would I really even put it on my dad. Like at some point we take agency in our own hands, and we have that conversation
mhm,
with ourselves. I'm kind of on the opposite end of that spectrum of I have almost ended my life. I have been, suicidal. I was suicidal for 19 years,
wow,
from the day that my dad died. I don't think I ever stopped thinking about either his suicide or my own suicide for 19 years. I had it every single day of my life for 19 years until the day I almost ended my life. And that was my kind of moment where I had to really rethink, what I was looking at, right? And then, lo and behold, I'm here now with a book called literally Defy the Darkness, um, that I wrote. I've been thinking about that because I published it July 17th last year, so it's just over a year now.
mhm,
Um, that book title is my perspective on human life, right? Of like looking at you can't escape the hardships, you can't escape the
mhm,
darkness of the darkness and the dismal realities that is human life, right? Like we can build incredibly beautiful and impressive societies, but you will never be able to escape the fact that you're going to die someday, that
mhm.
other people are going to die, other people are going to get hurt, other people are going to do bad things. um, we're never going to escape that, not in my opinion.
No,
And
you're
so
right.
if
You're absolutely right.
right, and so if you don't take that into account and actively set yourself, like, defy the darkness to me is more of a verb, right? You have to commit to action of holding yourself accountable to say there's darkness within me. It's within every human being.
Mhm.
If you don't think human beings have the capacity for evil, then you're naive, in my opinion. You're
Yeah,
ignorant,
yeah.
and you have to be. That's not saying my dad or your dad is evil, but the capacity for us to succumb to our own insecurities, our own personal dilemmas and difficulties and traumas and all of these things that we've stacked on top of ourselves for years, um, it's there, it's out there.
Mhm.
And it very much takes action, it takes support, it takes people, it takes honesty. And that's where I've become so remarkably honest about everything that I talk about. You and I talked about this before.
Yeah, yeah.
uh, there's nothing off limits to us because I imagine, and this may be relatable to you, if we succumb to being dishonest with ourselves, where will we go? Right?
Yeah.
Like that we've seen that darkness, we felt that darkness, and we know that if we go that direction, there's nothing good that comes from that. And so having this ability to be remarkably honest about everything, even if I'm feeling terrible or feeling like shit, I'm honest about it. And that's necessary for me because if I do the opposite, I know the, I know I've been that direction. I don't want to do that again.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so it's really interesting to me. And in some ways it changes my perspective in terms of I've always thought honesty was the best option. But realistically, I was quite naive. I was quite ignorant because clearly this is also a case in point where honesty was not the best option.
No.
This one worked out for you. And I'm really curious how, you know, with having to re-grieve, obviously there were moments of, the anger, the frustration, kind of distancing. Tell me tell me what that was like for you in terms of like how did you rebuild your relationship with your deceased father after kind of seeing this and obviously feeling the anger and the frustration because I was there for many years.
Yeah.
But I'm curious how you went through that.
It was definitely, I think, a gradual process. It took a long, long time. It took a lot of years. I mean, I couldn't exactly tell you, when the end date was,
Yeah.
but I mean, I can definitely tell you when the start date was, and that was the day that, that I found out that truth. And I mean, I think the first real emotions that started to surface for me were definitely, of course, naturally toward my dad, but I was bullshit. I was so bullshit at him, not because he left me. I've still never, I know it's there, that whole abandonment issue,
Hmm.
that if you read about it, you realize that anyone who has any child
Yeah.
who has ever lost a parent, forget the circumstances, just any child who loses a parent has some form of an abandonment
Yeah.
issue somewhere. So I don't necessarily know that I've found mine quite yet, or been able to pinpoint it in the classic way,
Yeah.
but I was rip shit at my dad for leaving my mom, who had, so I'm an only child, so I have there are no siblings. And my mom was 40 years old, and she was, she worked at part-time as a secretary up the street for the local nursing home. And um you know, there she was, happily married one night, and the next morning she was a widow with a 10-year-old kid.
Yeah.
And I was just furious that he put her in that position. So that's all I felt for a really, really long time. Like, I don't know how long it was, but there are pictures all over my house of my father. Um, like, any opportunity that I have ever had to bring my father into a conversation, to remind my kids of a funny story or share something about him, like, I took it every chance I got. I did not talk about my father. It had to be 2 years. Like, I easily couldn't look at pictures when I walked by them in the house, cried myself to sleep. So at the time, our daughters were, when I found this out, our daughters were, I think one was in high school. I think one was in high school and one might have been in college, but they were both certainly old enough to really understand what was happening. I didn't tell them for the longest time. It was probably a good couple of years. And the only ones who knew were my husband and my mom. And those are the only people I had the conversations with. I cried myself to sleep, like hysterically crying myself to sleep for 3 years. Nobody knew it. Not a single friend knew it. Not a single family member knew
Yeah.
it. And I mean, I felt like I was living two different lives at the time. And I remember saying one night to Dave in bed, like, it rewrote everything.
Yeah.
It rewrote, like, everything, like, your memories play out like a movie in your head, and you kind of play that highlight reel. And I was like, no, 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 that everything is different now. And he actually said something that I couldn't quite grab onto initially, but it really ultimately ended up being true. He was like, I know these circumstances are now very different. I know, you're, it's now not a case of him being taken from you. He took himself from you. But that doesn't change everything you ever did together. That doesn't change every time he ever said I love you. That doesn't change how he felt about you and about mom, and all these things. And of course, I was just angry for
Yeah.
so long, and I was like, no, it changed everything. But I really came to a point where I understood that it didn't truly rewrite the narrative. It really just, um, that was just one part of it. Like, everything that did happen in my life up to that point, everything still happened the way it happened.
Yeah.
There was just a gap in information, that's all. And it took me a really long time. And I think it was really the thing, I think, that switched things for me from being so angry to really kind of accepting and forgiving, goes back to what I said a few minutes ago about my perspective on suicide being a selfish act, because it always felt that way to me.
Yeah.
And then when I started I couldn't read enough about people's suicide stories. I still am so drawn to that. That's what all my work now is all focused on.
Yeah.
And it was once I really started, like, peeling away those layers of, where is someone's headspace, and how desperate are they, and how beyond their control is their illness, and the fact that it is an illness, like a cancer, or a, something that you have to either treat, or you can't control it.
Yeah.
And that's what shifted things for me, when I finally realized that, um, he was sick. He was sick, and he was hurting, and he was living in a time when mental illness was so deeply stigmatized. And he obviously felt very alone, even though he had everyone in the world around him. And so that's kind of how I got from, day one to where I am now.
I think this is a good example of the fact that, and this is my belief, but I think there's always two narratives at play. I think there's the reality that we don't always see. It's kind of in the background, um, because that requires multiple perspectives to come together to say this is what really happened.
Mm,
And then there's our feelings, right? And our emotions and what we see, right? And so basically our narrative of the story. Um, and and when things like that happen, you see this dramatic, gap between those two things. And I think that gap is necessary, and that's why you have to rewrite your narrative, right? Like, it when you said it rewrote everything, I think that's a really powerful statement, because it had to.
mm,
Because you had to, for you, when you rewrite something in your mind, when you rewrite your narrative, that's you expressing those feelings and feeling those feelings. And when you don't do that, I think that usually becomes a problem, right?
yeah.
When you don't have the ability, to rewrite your narrative and then rewrite it again, right, to close that gap
Hmm.
back to reality, because I think that's also remarkably important. What you often have is what you just talked about, is this. I think it's not as much. I mean, I think it becomes a physical ailment, but I think what it is an illness of perspective. Because I've been on both sides of it. I had a father and his life by suicide, and then I almost ended my life by suicide. So I'm in a really interesting place. Then I also work with people that, um, consistently go through these things where they also want to end their life, and I put myself in a fairly risky situation to have that conversation with them, but I
Yeah.
can't do anything about it other than have a conversation. Um, so would I say I'm a subject matter expert? I think so, but I don't know. I just have conversations. But the reality is, I think that it's a perspective based problem. Is it oftentimes mixed with physical issues and physical ailments? Absolutely. I think, depression and anxiety, all of these things come, but I think they really come from one, oftentimes it comes from early childhood trauma.
Hmm.
And then later on, you stack up a lot of different problems, and then it becomes a physical ailment, right? Because when you have childhood trauma, it changes how your brain operates, changes, you know, chemical receptors in the brain, it changes hormones. And so you develop problems like CPTSD, bipolar, depression, anxiety, all these things. And then those physical ailments then inform your perspective because of how other people treat you,
Yeah.
right? And so I really think that if you want to solve the suicide problem, it's, how do we teach people perspective? How do we bring people together to talk about perspective, right? Because from my perspective, dishonesty was my downfall. I could not, I did not know how to be honest with myself.
Yeah.
I didn't know how to allow other people in to be honest with me. And so it was this lack of honesty. It was this dishonesty on my part, because my perspective emphasized this gap in my story, in my narrative of reality versus what I was willing to look at.
Mm,
I was never willing to go dig into reality until I was ready to.
yeah.
And so, I really think that, you know, if there's anything, your perspective is the first place you start, right? You could start with depression, you could start with anxiety, you could start with bipolar, you could start with all of those disorders if you want to. But what I found with people who really struggle with, um, consistently struggle with suicide, it's the perspective that matters,
Yeah.
because you can't. It becomes really remarkably hard to actually solve physical ailments if you don't have the perspective to actually look at them.
Yeah.
And so, like, that's where I start. That's where, most of my work starts and ends, because I'm not qualified to do the physical stuff.
Hmm.
Um, but people need to be in touch with reality. And I think, not to say that all suicidal people uh, aren't, but there's a piece of reality that they're willing to forego to say, I want to end my life. I
Yeah.
want to give up. And so but it's remarkably complicated because it's never, it's never the same story. And so I always try and I always ask more questions uh than I give answers to, and
Hmm.
that's the I think the weird thing for most people that come to me is like they're expecting me to answer their questions, and I'm like, I'm sorry, I'm here to ask you questions.
Right, because they're the ones ultimately who have to do the work.
Yeah,
You
and
know, they're the ones who have to be vulnerable.
it's their context, right?
Yeah.
How can I answer any questions about you that I know nothing about you?
Right.
You know,
Right.
I would be doing you a disservice if I started answering your questions about my perspective, right? We're in
Yeah.
different places, and I need to know exactly how you think before I can really help you understand that maybe your thought process isn't valuable to you,
Yeah.
right? And that's really, I think, the biggest part is when I do my work, when I work with people, I am not here to tell you how to think. I am here to reveal to you how you think, and
Mm.
then you can judge it on your own, right? And the people that are successful are able to look at themselves and say, "Man, I might be a little fucked up," right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
that's exactly what I did in 2015. I spent 3 days after my suicide attempt looking at myself and saying, "Holy shit, what did I
Yep.
do to myself?" Like that's exactly what I was thinking because it was a moment that I you could watch the timeline just slowly build up to be this big elephant in the room, but I never did anything about it. I never did anything at all in terms of like how can I solve this? There's all sorts of places I could go, especially as a veteran. Right?
Sure.
I have all sorts of resources, but I wouldn't use any of them.
Yeah. Because it's scary. It's,
Yeah,
being vulnerable at the end of the day, being vulnerable is a really scary place for a lot of people,
yeah,
because
especially men.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And you'd be surprised how scary it is for women
Yep,
also to be
absolutely.
vulnerable. Because there's this, I don't want to say perceived weakness with women because I'm a woman and I don't perceive any women as being weak. However, we're always labeled as the more emotional and the emotional ones, and
I
uh,
would
you know,
disagree.
yeah, I know, and I love that. I love that you would, but I think honestly, like I'm listening to you talk, and I love everything that you're saying because it is so important to really just kind of own our own unique truth because there's no healing or solving or um moving forward from anything that we struggle with without that honesty piece. And I
Yeah,
think, and this is why this year in particular for me, just as a human being, has been such a transformative year. Because I mean, I've always been an open and honest person. I mean, certainly in the work that I do, everything that I write about is anecdotal. So it's what's happening in my family or
yeah.
with the kids that I was teaching or coaching or whatever it was. But there was for a long, long time, I still told people who questioned me about how I lost my dad. I still told them for years after I knew the truth that my father died of a heart attack because I was not in a place where I was ready to say that out loud. And I don't know if it was that much of a stigma issue. I don't think that is what played into it for me, but then again, I'm sure that there has to be some piece of it that it was more just kind of the shock and disbelief of it than
Yeah.
a stigma piece. But I couldn't say it out loud. um I mean, and once I did, everything changed for me. Everything
Yeah.
changed for me because all of a sudden there was nothing left to hide,
Yeah.
nor did I want to hide anything. And the more I talked about it, the more I wanted to talk about it because of how people received it and how
Oh my
it
God. Yeah.
just, oh my God, like it
Yeah.
all of a sudden it's like people come out of the woodwork and
Yep.
you just automatically kind of inherited a community.
Yep.
by virtue of
Yeah.
saying this happened to me or that happened to me, or I'm part of this cohort who had this thing. And I mean, I also came out last year, just barely over a year ago, as pansexual. I've been married for almost 30 years. I have two grown daughters. Um, and I am madly in love with my husband. Love my family. It has nothing to do with anything more than just an owning of another truth. And I mean, all of those things, my father's suicide included, are things now that I can't talk enough about to people. And
Right.
it's changed everything for me, just because once you realize that you're absolutely not alone. I mean, your circumstances might be unique. My story's a little unique, your story might be unique, but at the end of the day, like, loss is still loss.
We all share the same emotions.
Yep, we do. We
We
do.
and they're not again, like you're right, the context is always going to be different, right? We can't replicate the same context in people. I
Right.
just don't think that's possible. Um, but we can replicate the same emotions. And so when people use the idea that I don't think anyone would understand, it's I don't think it's necessarily about looking at someone else and saying you have to be able to understand this. It's more
Yeah.
about I have no idea how to explain this. And so, I think it's really about when you're in that place, you need to be able to learn how to use different words. You need to go
Yeah.
find the words to use to explain what you have,
Hmm.
because it's not about finding other people that will do the work and understanding you. It's about learning how to express it, expose it, and that's why you're right. Like you inherit a community when you talk about anything that anything of hardship, right?
Hmm.
Because there's always people willing to listen, um, because they're trying to learn how to use the words about their own context,
Right.
and when you start talking, that's rare, right? When you start expressing yourself about something that's hard in life, certainly I'm an example of this. I started talking about TikTok, talking about suicide on TikTok, 2 years ago, and here I am
Hmm.
with almost 600,000 followers, and I'm
I
like,
know.
right? Like I have no idea, right? Like
Yeah.
you talked to me 2 years ago, being like, "Hey, you're going to have over 500,000 followers in 2 years." I'd be like, "You're crazy, right?
Yeah.
I was hoping for 500, maybe
Yeah.
1,000, right?
Hmm.
That'd be cool." But
Yeah.
here I am with all these people that consistently come back to me and tell me I'm doing a good thing. Um, it's powerful, right?
Yeah.
And it's humbling, very humbling.
It is. It absolutely is. And you know what it is? And I've started kind of identifying it this way when I talk to people about sharing our experiences. It's like you flip on a beacon
Yeah,
that just sends a pulse out there into the world about the thing that you're talking about, or about the issue that you have, that, is kind of a call and response
right.
to the people who are out there in the world who are going through some version of what you're going through. And because we get our personal fears and thoughts and experiences can be so incredibly isolating. Like, we all know, we're all you know well educated human beings, well enough to know that we all know we go through shit. Everybody goes through shit, and there's so many different kinds, and yet we all end up behaving as though I'm the only one who's going through this. There's no other parent who's ever felt the way that I feel right now, or no other suicide loss survivor, or cancer patient, or whatever it is. And it's when we open our mouth and we start talking that people can make those connections, and we can grow and strengthen those
Yeah.
communities.
And you don't
S-
that I think when you start opening your mouth, you start realizing how wrong you have been.
mm,
And that's a pretty powerful place to be, is
yeah.
when you start being humbled. That's not to be disrespectful of anything, right? It's really about when you have conversations like we are having right now, um, in many different capacities, right? You taught me something today. And I love that. I love being humbled. I love being wrong, because now it allows me to then connect with more people, because me being right doesn't matter, right? I like I will certainly have my, 500,000 followers look at a conversation like this and be like, yeah, that's awesome. Right.
Mm.
But when I'm wrong, I now get to add to that community because now I can connect in a different way. And those 500,000 people may say, yeah, I don't agree with that, but I don't care. Right. Like I'm
Yeah.
not, I'm not here to have a conversation with all, 8 billion people on the planet. I'm here to have conversations that can meet people where they are in multiple different capacities. That's why I've had transgender people on here. It's why I've had men, I've had women, I've had coaches of all types. I've had authors. I've had everyone that I can find to have a conversation with. I'm going to do that because I'm going to meet as many people as I can where they are and show people that you can have a respectful conversation, a- and enjoy that, right? And dig into people, challenge people respectfully. I try to do that.
Mhm.
There are some episodes that do it better than others, but it's a dual conversation, right? It's two people trying to figure out like what is the right way to live. And here's the thing that I've found: I don't think there is a right way to live.
I couldn't agree with you more because there isn't.
Yeah,
There isn't. But at the same time too, there are things that you might do in your life or through your work that are beneficial to me.
right.
Just even maybe it's just um an idea or a philosophy, or maybe it's some kind of self-care that you
Yep,
did for yourself that I didn't even think of. You know, there's always, when we have these kinds of conversations, these open and raw, honest conversations where we're not trying to cut anyone down, we're not trying to discredit anyone, we're trying to really just understand where each person is. um, that's where the give and the take comes in. That's what
yep,
makes it so powerful. And that's when everybody hopefully can find their own unique takeaway. All the people who are listening to you and I talk today, hopefully, there's something that one of us has said today that resonates enough that that person grabs that nugget, and that leaves a mark. It leaves a
right.
positive mark. That's the whole point.
That's the plan, right?
Yep. Yeah, for sure.
I'm curious with, obviously we've talked a lot about being a child in many regards of like we're looking up at our parents, and we're looking at that aspect. You've become a mother, obviously, of two young women now. um how did all of this, I guess, impact, like how was that transition from, knowing your dad had died by natural causes, and then, transition into suicide? How did that play an impact on your parenting? And I'm really curious about, like, obviously you've had a column about parenting. Like
Mm.
how has this transitioned in how you approach parenting?
You know, Dave and I have always been, we're very aligned in this way. I mean, we've been together forever, and we're very much aligned in the way that we do most things, certainly in the way that we parent our daughters. And so we've always been extremely open with our girls, whatever it might be that we're talking about. Um, it's always kind of family meeting style, and it has been in a very age appropriate way, starting when they were young, things that we knew that they could handle, and obviously now there's very little, if anything, that we would never, that we would ever keep from them. So we've always been really, really honest. Um, it there was a real seismic shift in me to get to a place, if this makes sense, to arrive at a place. There's an urgency for me to do the work to forgive my father and understand his mental illness as best I could without having, like, all the actual details of,
Yeah,
what happened. Um, and what brought him to where he was. So there became like this real urgency, because at the time that we told our girls, as I said earlier, it was not immediately. Like, I knew that my dad had taken his life for a number of years while I was kind of working through that and processing that and grieving that, before I actually sat down with them and like had the conversation. Like, okay, you thought this is what you knew about Papa Jimmy to be true, and this actually is not true. Our Both of our daughters, and at the time our oldest, was going through her own struggles with mental illness and is very open about that now, and has been seeing a therapist for many years, and it changed her life, absolutely changed her life in ways that I we don't even have enough time today for me to tell you how much it has positively impacted her life and our relationship, and the way she moves around in the world. um, it became urgent to me to let my children understand kind of what their genetic baggage was, if that makes any sense,
Yeah.
because we are who we are inherently. Like, your DNA is Dylan's DNA, and there's a lot of just unique Dylan stuff in there, but then you've got your mom, you've got your dad, you've got your family, your history, your DNA. And so there are other factors that obviously make us who we are, that are beyond just where we were raised or how we were raised. And there's a cocktail in every single one of us, and sometimes it doesn't get shaken up right away. Sometimes it's, you could be in your late teens, you could be in your 20s. Something can shift in you when you're in your 40s, and all of a sudden, kind of a door opens that you never knew was there, and you start to struggle. So the way that it changed the way that I parent is by being completely and totally transparent about what had happened with my dad, and what kind of was on Dave's side in terms of mental illness, and other things that were on my father's side of the family with mental illness, and why it's so important to know that and to understand that, and to kind of file that away, and to always make sure those lines of communication between all of us were open. I'm like, if you're struggling and you don't feel like you can tell me, tell your dad, tell your sister, tell your grandmother, talk to, like, everybody knows the playing field is level. um we're being completely transparent, and you need to make sure that you recognize that if something doesn't feel right, there's there's obviously a reason for it, and let's talk about it, let's work through it, let's get whatever help you might need. And that's how things changed for me. I wanted, like, every card to be up and on the table, so that we all knew what we were dealing with. And if the time ever came that, shit went down, and my children were struggling for whatever reason, they felt confident that they could reach out and connect and get help, because of how important that is.
That is, it's so interesting how remarkably similar my philosophy is, and
Mm.
how I parent. I have a stepson that's 10 years old, and that was one of the first things that when I met him when he was 4, but throughout the years the conversation has always been had of, I'm not here to tell you what's the right way to live for you. My job here is to make sure you get, you know as far as you can, and help you along the way. And the only way I can do that is for you to communicate with me. And
Mm.
that's been a struggle throughout the years because of his own history. But it has, like, especially lately, it's been a place where he can really open up and be honest and be forthright about how he feels and what he's going through. Where I think it's taken him a long time to get there, because you trust takes time,
Yeah.
like, and especially as a step parent, how remarkably difficult it is to be a step parent. And I look at him as my son. Like, that's how I treat him. I don't even know how. The only reason I say stepson is because, to put it into perspective for people.
Yeah.
Because it would be confusing to be like, he's my son, and then he talks about his actual dad, and then me as a dad. Like, I just want to make sure that people understand the delineation of what it means to be a step parent is so remarkably difficult.
Mm.
And walking into that is no it, it's no it's not a piece of cake.
Yeah.
It is one of the hardest jobs I've ever had to step into. But when you do it the right way, or I shouldn't say right way, the way that I think you and I do it,
Mm.
where you step in, regardless of whether you're a step parent or not, but when you step in and say, I'm not here to tell you this is the exactly the way you have to do it, but to give you an opportunity to communicate with me openly and honestly. um, I would forego teaching my son right from wrong if it means he's more able to communicate with me. Because at then at that point, what you can do is then you can have a conversation about right and wrong versus, this is the right way, and then it turns out to be the wrong way in 10 years. And it gets people hurt, gets people, you know, upset with him or whatever, right? Like I want to teach my son and my daughter, right? Because I have a new daughter,
Mhm.
um, to communicate because that's what I never had growing up. I didn't, it wasn't my mom's fault. And I wouldn't even say it was my dad's fault.
Mm.
I didn't know how to communicate. I didn't want to communicate, right? Especially after losing my dad, I didn't want to communicate. I had no inspiration to sit there and have a conversation where I poured my eyes out about losing my dad or my anger, my frustration with it. And certainly, clearly, my dad didn't have that opportunity either, right? My dad was uh, had a childhood worth full of child abuse, right, and abuse from an alcoholic father. Um, and so he didn't have the ability to communicate. I didn't have the ability to communicate. I'm going to teach my kids the ability to communicate.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
it's so powerful.
yeah, and not only that is I'm going to give them a father that's not going to be judgmental,
Mhm.
right? Because I think that itself, having at least one parent that limits the judgment, that withholds the judgment, right? I may not like everything that you're doing, but I'm not going to sit there and judge you and say like that is profoundly wrong. I'm going to say if you do this, this is the reality that happens,
Right. Right.
right?
Well,
That's it.
here's the thing. I mean, we're not the end all be all.
Right.
Like, sure, we're in the position of being the parent, and by nature of being the parent, we're obviously, the older, more experienced, lived more life human being in the equation.
Mhm.
But I don't have all the answers. I've told my
Right.
kids from day one, from the time that they really could like internalize it. I'm like, look, I'm gonna screw this up a lot. If I can
Yep.
have like a 500 season at the end of the day, you know what I
Yep.
mean? And I can screw up a little less than I get it right, then it's a win as far as I'm concerned. But I'm like, there are times, and especially, and you'll see this as you go, and I'm sure you've seen it with your son already, that there are times that you're gonna be so convinced, like, I think I know what's best. Like I'm pretty sure I know what's best. And then it turns out we don't.
No clue.
We don't,
Yep.
you know? And that's a sobering reality when we realize that we are not supposed to have all the answers. We are supposed to pass along the the wisdom that we have that has served us in the form of I did this and this is how this worked out, not this is what you have to do in this situation and in that situation, look, it's all in the way that we communicate. It's not just about being able to communicate, it's how we communicate.
Right.
And we've always talked to our kids you know like they had the capacity to understand, like we respected them and we tried as best we could. It's not to say that I didn't lose my shit with them over the years,
Right.
because we all have. But for the most part, like we always just wanted to have a conversation with them in a way that treated them with the kind of respect that we wanted them to treat us with. And like so far so good. And I know that both of our daughters have been very open, especially as they've gotten older, super open with us because they're both still living under our roof because of COVID. Um, they'll always say how much they appreciated the fact that we always made decisions, most decisions, as a family together, where we always taught had the hard conversations openly and honestly, and they appreciated that. And they never felt like they were being talked at, which was big as far as they were concerned, and we cared about their opinion. And it's little things like that when you make a child feel like you actually want to hear what they have to say and you ask them, like that's game changing stuff,
Right.
because we spend so much of our time just talking at our kids
Yep.
because I think we feel we have to, but we really really don't have to.
No.
They
And
have just as much they can teach us as we can teach them.
yeah. Now I grew up with a um he never luckily never had the opportunity to become my stepdad. Um but he was my mom's boyfriend after uh my dad passed. I grew up in an abusive household. of him, right? He was the disciplinarian. He was the punisher, right, of sorts. Um, and he led the household by fear, right? He was in charge, and you knew it because he was willing to use physical violence to manage that. I grew up in that, right? And when I was young, I respected that. But as I've grown to become a father myself, I now look at my son and I look back at that time and I have complete disrespect for it.
Yeah.
I can't abide by that because I I have watched my son grow as a human being and soon to be a man without ever laying a hand on him physically. And you don't have to, right?
No, you
You don't
don't.
have to physically punish a child that has no idea the concept of what physical violence means,
Mhm.
right? That doesn't mean you can't teach him physical violence, right? Like me and him wrestle, me and him box, right? Like
Yeah.
we we do it what boys do, but we do it in a controlled fashion, not in a you did something wrong, so now I need to beat you for it,
Yeah.
because that's what I was taught. Um, it doesn't make any sense because children, especially at the age that I was abused, I have no idea how to conceptualize that, how to process that emotionally. And the proof is in the pudding, right? I almost ended my life because of it, right? I've put myself through remarkable amounts of pain that I probably shouldn't have, um, because of it. And that doesn't mean that it didn't have its benefits, right? It certainly put me in places where it became beneficial, right? But the places were altogether not healthy for me to be, right?
Yeah.
I've been to Afghanistan twice, right? I volunteered for both, right? You know, and you can look at that as heroic, and I don't really look at it. It was a job, and I enjoy it for what it is, but at the same time, war is not healthy, right? And I'll be the first to say that as a soldier that's been there twice, it is not healthy. It's not a healthy place to be, even in the right mindset, right? I went in 2012 in the worst time in my life, right? I think that was by and far the most unhealthy perspective that I held was in 2012 and 2013 when I was in Afghanistan. I learned a lot. I came home with a lot, but I still was not healthy when I came home, and I got worse following that.
Mhm.
But then again, after my suicide attempt and after I did the work, as we say, for 4 years, in 2019, I went again to Afghanistan, and I was in a great place. I was in one of the strongest places I've ever been, up until obviously now. I think this is the strongest place I've ever been.
Mhm.
But even in 2019, right? I started my book prior to that deployment. I was building up to it. I was building the outline. I was about to start writing. And when I got to Afghanistan, I was going to continue. I was going to do that. I was going to write my book in Afghanistan because I had a lot of time, right?
Yeah.
Couldn't, because emotionally it was just a very remarkably unhealthy place, right? And it wasn't really, Afghanistan in 2019 wasn't even a war at that point.
Yeah. True.
It was a I don't even know what to say it was. Like we stayed on base half the time because the threat was too imminent for US forces to put themselves out there. And so we just kind of stayed on base. Well, I still went on 100 missions, but it really wasn't what it was in 2012 when I saw a lot more difficult things. And so even then, it wasn't healthy, right? Was it That doesn't mean it wasn't good for me. I learned a lot. I brought home a lot. I've taken a lot from it, but not healthy, right?
Yeah.
And so, like that ability to compartmentalize pain, and suffering and discomfort and distress, uh, though it benefited me in war, was not healthy for me, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And when you consistently deploy, or when you're constantly going into your own, you know, quote unquote wars, right? Because you could look at like people like first responders or healthcare workers, right? You are constantly going into your wars. You're
Oh,
constantly
for
going into
sure.
stressful situations, and you're burdening yourself with the most unhealthy things, environments that you could possibly choose. That's not to say we don't need you, right? but there's no processing, and certainly it probably comes from your past of
Yeah.
what you've been taught to be okay or healthy. Um, Working your life away for relatively little enjoyment is not healthy, right? It's beneficial for someone's pocketbook, but it's not healthy for you. And that's something that, as a society, we certainly are addressing via social media. But I think we, in policy and um, mindfulness within the country's political system and economic system, we need to start becoming more mindful of.
Yeah.
Um,
We absolutely do.
but yeah, I mean, it's a remarkable situation when you start to understand what is what is actually beneficial for me and what is not. um
Well, that's where the whole honesty piece comes in.
exactly.
If you're not being honest, you have no way to accurately answer that question.
Yeah. And then when you take that and apply it to being a parent, it's
Yeah.
there's the challenge, right? Like, because now you have to you have to give to this little human being that doesn't understand what you understand, and you have to give it to them in a way that they can process. um and how I work is I do it. It's a long term process, right? So I told my son asked me the question, like, where's grandpa, right? Like, where's my dad, right? What
Yeah.
happened to your dad? At 6 years old. My mother-in-law did not like it, but I told him the truth. I told him this is what this is what happened to my dad, right? And I had the conversation with him. He didn't understand it, but that's okay. I didn't need him to, right?
Yeah.
What I did was I was comfortable with having that conversation over time, and now he understands it. But he also understands the ability to have that conversation and say, "This is what I'm feeling,"
Right.
right? And that is something that I wish I had in my youth, right? And that's that's a hard it's a hard conversation to have as a parent,
It is a
because I
hard
think it's
conversation,
necessary.
but right, that's it right there. It is necessary because when we have those hard conversations, we we're showing our kids, we're modeling for our kids that it's important to talk about the things that are on your mind, that are in your heart, that are weighing you down in particular. And this whole notion of, things being taboo or things being, um, toxic, it, it sends the wrong message. That's what causes kids to just internalize everything,
Hmm.
especially when they're young. If they don't believe they're in an environment where they can communicate how they're really feeling, then they're going to grow up to be adults who don't communicate how they're really feeling. And
Right.
that's the crux of, I think, the so much of the mental health crisis right now is that people don't allow themselves to be vulnerable, don't take advantage of the outlets that they have and the resources that they have, and so they're forced to kind of, it's like the equivalent of self-medicating.
Yep.
They're kind of trying to talk themselves down or talk themselves off a ledge, and what they really need is someone else in the room to help them do that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's always been one of the one of the gaps that hasn't been filled by the mental health system itself. Is it's not that it's not beneficial, it's that how it operates. uh there's two things here. I think how it operates doesn't invite people to have the conversation with them, right? Because
Mhm.
it's been, for a long time, it's been so focused on medication versus actually having an understanding of this person that's in front of me.
Yeah.
And I think that's changing. I've definitely seen more things change, but the past 40, 50 years, that's been questionable, right?
Yeah.
And then not only that, but integrating people like myself and like you, that we don't have the qualifications that fit the mental health system, but we have the lived experience that helps bring people together, right? And it's not about talking to the people that we talk to. It's about clinicians and therapists, and about connecting the dots of, if I as a therapist never experienced what Dylan or Lisa has experienced, maybe I should understand a little bit about their perspective.
Yeah.
And I think that's might be what's missing, right? Because I deal with people, I shouldn't say deal, I work with people that that won't go to the mental health system. They won't go to therapists. They won't go to a psychiatrist or
Yeah.
an emergency department for mental health because of either past trauma, because of them, or re-traumatization. So many different things, or because they just don't listen
Yeah.
to what their context is. And so I really think there is a gap in the mental health system that needs to be filled if it's to be more successful, if it's to capture the people that we're losing right now, right? So we lose 45,000 people a year to suicide
Hmm.
on average, right? And that number has gone up until 2019, and then 2020 happened. We don't know exactly what, I haven't seen the recent statistics, but it went down in 2019, but I imagine 2020
And
was
then it surged.
right.
Yeah.
I can't imagine that it went down again. We all know.
Yeah.
But there's a gap, and we need to have that conversation. I don't know if the mental health system is having that conversation. I'm not privy to those conversations, but I think it should, because
I hope that they are, because that's the only way that we're going to experience real, true change.
you know,
You know.
integration,
Yeah.
and it's uncomfortable because what qualification do I have, right? Or what qualification do you have? Because we're
Yeah. You know what? That's interesting, though. It's interesting that you say that. Um, I think honestly, we may have some of the most important qualifications, which are those lived experiences. Because I mean, I don't know about you, but I mean, you know, I'm very open and honest about the fact that I'm not a clinician. I'm not
same.
a trained therapist. I mean, I just recently finished getting trained to be a crisis counselor with the Trevor Project. If you've ever heard of
I
the
haven't.
Trevor Project, they are the world's largest crisis support service for LGBTQ youth who are at risk.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and so I mean that beyond that formal training, so now I'm a clinician with them. Before that, I mean, everything that I wrote about or talked about had just to do with my own personal experience in those places and spaces, and and it's so interesting to me the number of people over the years who have responded to that saying it's because it feels so relatable. It's because you're not a clinician that I feel like
Yep.
I'm responding better to this
Right.
or to you, or I'm connecting more with what you're saying, because it's an odd kind of a stigma, I think, um, that I don't know. I think people are just they're poised differently when they know that they're talking to a clinician versus talking to,
Yep.
maybe just somebody else who's had the same experience that they have. So I
Right.
think, well, and that goes back to what we've been talking about all along, how incredibly important it is that we share our collective experiences, because that's how we grow the base of the communities that we're in,
Absolutely. Because
and how
it's
we
I don't look at you as a person coming to me, right? Like I might look at it from my experience. I look at it differently than the bad therapists that they've been to, right?
mm,
The therapists that they've been to that are bad, right? And here's some red flags for therapists. Um, Things not to do.
yeah,
Uh, Assuming that your answer is the right answer, right?
yeah,
As a therapist is a red flag, because with how much and how complex trauma can be, and the conversations that we have about mental health, you can't know what the right answer is. But if you pull out the book and say this is what the DSM says, or this is what this theory says, you're hyper focusing on something that's far more complicated, and you just can't, not with a person that doesn't have the capacity to fully understand these things.
yeah.
Being diagnosed in the first session or first two sessions without fully understanding what's happening to this person, what has happened to this person.
Hmm.
um, you know it's building trust over time, and that's from what I understand, there's some in some cases there's an insurance issue, which that sounds like a problem to me,
Hmm.
right? Because then the um the relationship is focused on financial means rather than trust, right?
Right. Yep.
Where people pay me, but here's the thing. I I build the relationship because I want to, right?
Mhm.
And I need to. I have a desire to. When you're billed through insurance, like is if you're not a, if you're a therapist and you don't have a desire to build the relationship, I mean you're gonna hurt people. You're gonna lose people.
Yep.
And so there's so many. I could keep going on and on about red flags of the system, um, but good therapists, because I've met some, I've had some on the podcast before. Good therapists build the relationship.
Right. Because
Good.
how can you have a, a meaningful conversation, a powerful conversation with someone that speaks to them and their trauma and their unique situation if you don't know what their unique situation really is?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I really hope that that conversation is had more often at the mental health systematic level. Because I really think lived experience is a really powerful addition, right? I don't think it's everything. I don't want people to just come to me. I
Mhm.
actually I actually recommend that when people come to me and work with me, go to a therapist as well, right?
Mhm.
Because now you're getting two people that have two different perspectives about what you're going through. And you're getting strategies from two different realms, right?
Yeah.
Clinical versus lived experience. And they're both beneficial.
Hmm.
Um, and that doesn't mean it's risky, or it's not risky to go to lived experience. It is. You have to find someone that actually, I think, operates with a capacity of understanding that you can hurt people if
Hmm.
you're not careful. You
Right.
have to be able to choose your words wisely. You have to be able to treat people with respect. You also have to treat people with the idea that you don't know what's right for them.
Right.
And you can't make decisions for them. I really, that is one thing that's the first thing I tell you, right? If you come to me, I'm like, I'm not here to fix you. I'm not here
Yeah.
to make your decisions for you. I'm here to give you an understanding of reality. Um, but ultimately, you have to be the arbiter of your own decisions. You
Hmm.
make them, right? I can help you understand them, but you make them.
Well, that's agency. That's
Yep.
what you talked about before about agency. And when I hear you say that, I think about all the experience that I've just had recently, these last several months training to be a crisis counselor with the Trevor Project. And that is the basis of everything that they do. It's two things. It's
Hmm.
making sure that the contact who's calling, who's in crisis, is completely in control of their own agency
Yep.
in everything you say and in everything you do, and it's holding space, and
Yep.
it's the combination of those two things. Like I can't give that. It was a definite mind shift for me because so often we use our own experiences as a way of helping someone connect with us, and maybe my shared experience is beneficial to you in some way. it, this is a very different kind of situation. It's all about encouraging them to peel away their own layers and guiding them to make their own discoveries and revelations about themselves or the situation they're in, and asking prompting questions. It's not about volunteering anything about myself or anything about my history or anything about my own experiences, but it's strictly focusing on someone's agency. And that's really powerful because when you can there's you think about it, if you arrive at a conclusion on your own and someone else kind of leads you to that conclusion, which one is more powerful? It's
Hmm.
when you get there
Yep.
and you've done that work to arrive in that place. It's way more impactful than getting there any other way.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Lisa, I feel like we could continue to talk for hours and hours about so many different subjects.
I think we could. Yeah.
But we should probably call it, uh, being almost what is an hour and a half at this point. I'm sure at some point we'll have another conversation. The podcast is long term, so we'll have you back on for sure.
I would love that. Absolutely would love it.
Before I ask you the final question, I just want to ask you: is there anything that you want to direct people to right now? Do you have a new book out? Do you have a website? What do you want people to know that you're working on right now that they could definitely see?
Yeah, I really appreciate that so much. I mean, as I said, I said earlier, I've really kind of pivoted the work that I'm doing. I mean, I've been a parenting writer and author for so many years now, and while I'm not completely changing lanes altogether from that space, I definitely have shifted gears more toward suicide awareness and prevention. So I don't have a book to point to at this exact moment, but I'm in the process of writing my fourth book, and it is the story. Um, of my father's suicide, and I'm really writing it as a vehicle to just help people start talking about their own stories. So that maybe I can at some point when that's out in the world, come back and we can chat more
I would
about
love to.
that. But that's definitely happening, and I am doing an awful lot of writing on the side um, about about that subject as well. I mean, you can find me all over the place. If you go to lisasugarman.com, that's where just about everything that I do is located. And then I mean, I would encourage people. I've mentioned a couple of times the work that I'm doing with the Trevor Project, um, for LGBTQ youth who are in crisis, who are suicidal. I would say take a look at the organization. They are exploding right now, all over the place. I wish it was for a great reason. We certainly don't want a mental health service to be exploding, because that means people are needing help. But pay attention to them. Take a peek and see what they're doing, and see how you can help. I will be on their platform on the phones, taking calls, and that's become a really important organization for me. So, yeah, I mean, you just like I said, go to lisasugarman.com, and whatever I'm working on, you will find there.
Perfect. Well, and all of those links and anything that you can find out about Lisa will be in the description below. But let's get to the final question so you can answer that.
Yeah.
We can hear your answer. If there was one thing that you could leave the world, one message you could leave the world, Lisa, what would that be?
Wow, that's a big question. You know what? I would honestly have to say, really try and embrace the power of positivity. Um, we often underrate our ability to control that part of ourselves. We can't control a lot in this life. We're constantly acting and reacting based on what's happening around us, but our attitude is ours alone. How we receive something that the world is giving us, or that someone in that world is giving to us, is on us. And this is not to say that you have to walk around the world, with rainbows floating over your head, but at the same time, we all have that power and ability to choose to be positive. And I think if I could, leave that to the world as a collective reminder to harness that, and know that it's always within your control, that would be what I would pass along.
Perfect. I love it. I absolutely agree. There's a book that I always recommend, from an author who actually passed, I think, in 2020 or 2021, um, by Trevor Mawad. It's called "It Takes What It Takes." He talks about going from negative to neutral rather than going from negative to positive.
Hmm.
Negative, neutral, positive, and try. If you can't be positive, just don't be negative.
Yeah.
And that's step one. I love positivity, but you've got to find, if you can't go straight to positivity, find neutral,
Yeah.
right?
I like that. I like
A-
that a lot.
and
Yeah.
then build to positive, right? Because positive, it's not about toxic positivity, it's about finding a way to be positive about yourself, right?
Hmm.
And that's it's a good message. I love it.
Right.
Well, Lisa, thank you for being on. Thank you for sharing all that you've shared today, and being open and honest about everything. Um, Make sure that if you're listening to this, you get an opportunity to check out Lisa. The links will be in the description below. Um, and I just want to thank you all for listening again, and we'll catch you next time on the Dylan Experience. And that is it.